Hello, everybody. My name is Susan Bontly, and welcome to the reading of More Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, collected from folklore and retold by Alvin Schwartz. This is the second of 3 books in his series about scary stories, all of which have either been challenged or banned on reasons of violence, scariness, too much for young minds, and also for its goriness in some cases. However, all of the stories that he has collected have been based on folklore that he has either read or been told. So I'm going to share with you tonight 4 different stories, and with each story, so we're going to start out with the first story called Rings on Her Fingers. And one of the inspirations for this story comes from a book called Folklore from Socorro, New Mexico. Daisy Clark had been in a coma for more than a month when the doctor said that she had finally died. She was buried on a cool summer day in a small cemetery about a mile from her home. May she always rest in peace, her husband said, but she didn't. Late that night, a grave robber with a shovel and a lantern began to dig her up. Since the ground was still soft, he quickly reached the coffin and got it open. His hunch was right. Daisy had been buried wearing 2 valuable rings, a wedding ring with a diamond in it and a ring with a ruby that glowed as if it was alive. The thief got down on his knees and reached into the coffin to get the rings, but they were stuck fast on her fingers. So he decided that the only way to get them off was to cut off her fingers with a knife. But when he cut into the finger with the wedding ring, it began to bleed, and Daisy Clark began to stir. Suddenly, she sat up. Terrified, the thief scrambled to his feet. He accidentally kicked over the lantern, and the light went out. He could hear Daisy climb out of her grave. As she moved past him in the dark, he stood there frozen with fear, clutching the knife in his hand. When Daisy saw him, she pulled her shroud around her and asked, "Who are you?" When the grave robber heard this corpse speak, he ran. Daisy shrugged her shoulders and walked on, never once looked back. But in his fear and his confusion, the thief fled in the wrong direction. He pitched headlong into her grave, fell on the knife, and stabbed himself. While Daisy walked home, the thief bled to death. Alvin Schwartz makes this note for readers. Before modern methods of embalming became widespread, there were many legends like Rings on Her Fingers. Each told of how some person had been given up for dead when actually they were in a coma or trance of some kind, and regained consciousness during their funeral or after they had been buried. In the latter case, those who were rescued from a horrible death owed their lives to grave robbers. In those years, thieves dug up corpses for their jewels or stole the corpses and sold them to medical schools. Now and then, the grave robbers found a living person who was revived by the shock of cold air or by the efforts they were making to cut off one of their fingers. He also relates a story about in the early 1800s, an English woman who was so concerned about being buried alive, she arranged to be buried in a funeral vault in a coffin without a lid. A small opening was left in the wall of the vault so that she could breathe and be heard if she regained consciousness. The next story is a little bit humorous, but still a little scary. It's called The Bad News. Leon and Todd loved baseball. When they were young, they played on the town's baseball team. Leon had been the pitcher, and Todd had played second base. Now that they were a lot older, they spent their free time watching baseball games on TV and talking about baseball. "Do you think they play baseball in heaven?" Leon asked Todd one day. "That's a good question," said Todd. "The one who gets there first should let the other one know somehow." As it turned out, Todd got to heaven first. and Leon waited patiently to hear from him. One day, Leon found Todd sitting in the living room waiting for him. Leon was very excited to see him. "What is it like up there?" he asked. "And what about baseball?" "When it comes to baseball," said Todd, "I have some very good news. And I have some bad news. The good news is that we do play baseball in heaven. We have some fine teams. I play second base on my team, just like I did in the old days. That's the good news." "What's the bad news?" asked Leon. "The bad news," said Todd, "is that you are scheduled to pitch tomorrow." Our next story is called The Brown Suit, and it has a slight twist at the end. A woman came into the funeral parlor to see her husband's corpse. "You did a good job," she said to the undertaker. "He looks just the way he always looked, except for one thing. My husband always wore a brown suit, but you have him dressed in a blue suit." "That is no problem," said the undertaker. "We can easily change that." When she returned later, her husband was wearing a brown suit. "Now he looks just like the way he always did," she said. "I know you went to a lot of trouble." "It was no trouble," the undertaker said. "As it happened, there is a man here who was wearing a brown suit, and his widow felt that the blue would look better. He is about your husband's size, so we gave him the blue one and gave your husband the brown one." "Even so," the widow said, "changing all that clothing must have been a big job." "Not really," said the undertaker. "All we did was exchange their heads." Our last story is based upon some folk tales out of the Ozark Mountains. It is called The Church. There was a fellow named Larry Berger who wasn't afraid of anybody alive, but anybody who was dead scared the wits out of him. One night, Larry was out driving in the country in his old Jeep when he got caught in a bad thunderstorm. The rain was coming down in sheets. Since his Jeep didn't have a top on it, Larry started looking for a place to take shelter. But at the first place he came to, he didn't even slow down. It was a deserted cabin, probably as dry as a bone inside. But Larry knew for a fact that it was haunted, and he wasn't going to stay there. A few miles farther, he came to an old abandoned church, standing all alone in a field. It hadn't been used in years. All the window glass was gone, but it still had sections of the roof intact. So Larry parked his Jeep and ran inside. It was as dark as could be in there. Larry groped around until he found a pew and sat down. It was nice and dry, just as he had thought it would be, and he stretched out his legs and made himself comfortable. Suddenly, there was a big flash of lightning, and Larry saw that he wasn't the only one in that church. There were people sitting in almost every pew. They all had their heads bowed as if they were praying, and they were all dressed in white. "These must be ghosts sitting in their shrouds," Larry thought. "They must have come in from some graveyard just to get dry." Larry jumped up and ran down the aisle as fast as he could, right smack into one of the ghosts. And the ghost, he went, "Pooh!" I hope you like these stories from More Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark by Alvin Schwartz. Again, this is one of our selections for readings. There are others that you can check out. There's a selection by Jose Aranda from Harry Potter, Tammy Powers from Captain Underpants, and To Kill a Mockingbird. You can find them, they'll be announced on Facebook, and you can follow the links. We will also post them on our Banned Books Research Guide and also on YouTube. Thank you for listening, and have a wonderful night.